Hi everybody, Curtis Mitch here from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another weekday reflection on today's Mass readings. Today is Monday, July 12th, and all of today's readings cluster around a single theme. It's about the persecution of the people of God, that when God puts his plan in play, the world opposes God's plan, and yet God's plan is inevitable. He will fulfill his purposes despite all opposition. Now, just a quick reminder, if you feel like these reflections are helpful to you and they enable you to get kind of recollected in your day and to think about the Lord and get yourself into Scripture a little bit more, please, we encourage you to hit that subscribe button below, along with the notification bell. That way, each time one of these is posted anew, you'll be among the first to know about it. So what I'd like to do today, all these readings, as I said, focus on the persecution of the people of God. I really want to zero in on that first reading. It's from the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verses 8 to 14, and then it tacks on verse 22. And today's reading is really about two things. It's about the growth of the people of Israel, and it's about the oppression of the people of Israel in Egypt. Okay? And neither one of these two things, if you're coming to the book of Exodus because you've read through the book of Genesis and you've arrived newly at this point in this first chapter of the next book, you're not really surprised by this information because it's already been indicated, not only foreshadowed, but foretold explicitly in Genesis. One, that Israel will multiply and grow. Remember what God said to Abraham. He said that he would bless him and multiply his seed exceedingly, right? Even the stars of the sky, insofar as they cannot be counted, the descendants of Israel and Abraham's descendants will not be countable, right? God's first promise to Abraham was that he would make him a goy gadol, a great nation. Right? So we already know that that's God's plan, and we just see it coming to fruition here now. We see it being realized on the stage of Israel's history. And then the oppression of Israel as well. If we had time, we'd go back and look at the book of Genesis chapter 15. Because in Genesis chapter 15, God tells Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not their own, and they will be slaves there. Right? They will be oppressed. So in the midst of all the good news that Abraham receives, that he will have multiple descendants and a great nation will rise up, all right, from his seed, we also learn that that seed will be enslaved and oppressed, at least for a period of time. And what this shows us, I think, on the surface, is just that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the patriarchs, who is now becoming the God of Israel, he is a God of his word. He is not a God of empty promises. He has a plan, he implements that plan, and no matter what the world tries to do, it cannot thwart his purposes, right? His holy designs to bring about the redemption of his people. So let's get into this passage, and then we're going to kind of reflect on it for just a little bit. This is Exodus chapter 1, beginning in verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the sons of Israel. So they made the sons of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they made them serve with rigor. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, what is this reading about here today? Well, I think we can look at it from two different angles. We can look at it historically, but we can also look at it spiritually and see how it actually applies to our own life. So first, historically, what are we talking about? Well, if you know the story of Genesis, you know that one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, was sold into slavery. He went to Egypt. He rose to power in Egypt. And eventually, he brought the entire family of Jacob down to Egypt. They settled there, and they settled there as honored guests. They were even given some of the choice real estate, right? The well-irrigated lands of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta. So they began life in Egypt as honored guests, but now the people of Israel, because of this new king who arises, they're now perceived as a national threat, a threat to Egypt's national security, right? What if our nation was to be attacked? This whole Hebrew population could rise up in opposition to us, and they could gain their freedom. And so you see this little element in the story of an element of irony and foreshadowing, that the whole reason why the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites is to make sure that they won't ever go free. And of course, as we know from the book of Exodus, that's precisely what happens. There's that little ironic element, right? The very thing they try to prevent is the very thing that will happen, right, in the days to come. But what do the Egyptians do? They implement a series of sinister countermeasures, right, you might say, to control the Hebrew people. One, they want to control them by enslaving them. Right? They conscript them into service for these public works projects, like building entire cities, building storage facilities, working as field laborers, and making their lives bitter. So the first thing they would try to do is control them. But then what the Pharaoh decides to do at the end here is to actually weaken Israel, right? To hamstring Israel's ability to be a fighting nation, right? To exert resistance against Egypt. How? By reducing the male population, by throwing all the sons of Israel into the Nile. And so it's a murderous policy of infanticide that is put in place to keep the Israel under the heel of the power of Egypt. Well, that's just the historical part of the story. But spiritually speaking, let's just switch gears here. What does this really mean for us? Well, as Christians have read the book of Exodus over the years, beginning with Jesus and the apostles and the very first generation of Christians in the first century, the book of Exodus was a story very much about the Christian life. It wasn't just an antiquarian epic story that we can remember and derive lessons from, right? It's nothing less than that, but it's a whole lot more than that, okay? Because the story of the Exodus is really the story of Christian salvation, right? It's being prefigured. It's pre-enacted on the stage of history in a way that will make sense to God's people when God sends his Messiah. All right, and so the enslavement in Egypt is an image of our slavery to sin, how sin overpowers us, how sin, apart from the redeeming grace of Christ, makes our lives bitter, how sin can be oppressive and domineering. And in our nature, our own natural resources, we don't have the power to outmuscle the power of sin in our lives. And that's why St. Paul says that we're slaves of sin apart from Christ. Not just that we fall into a sin occasionally, but that we're under the domination of sin's power in our life. And we don't have the power to free ourselves, to rescue ourselves. In fact, the early church fathers would develop this even further by talking about Pharaoh and his taskmasters in terms of the devil and his demons, right? His minions. How they are actively seeking, the powers of darkness are actively seeking to keep us enslaved. They don't want us to be liberated to serve God in the way that God intends and desires. And so the whole story of the Exodus is a story of Christian salvation kind of set out in advance. All right, so the Israelites will pass through the Red Sea, and the Father saw this as an image of our baptism, right? The Israelites would celebrate the feast of Passover on the very night of their deliverance, so that the shed blood of the Lamb would save them from the sword of the angel of death, and would be an indication that they are among God's people and they will be rescued, they will be delivered and sent to freedom. And that becomes an image of the Christian Eucharist, the Passover. So we have a baptism and we have Eucharist, and these are the things that liberate us from the dark powers that keep us enslaved. So the whole story of the Exodus for the early Christians was the story of our salvation. It was the story of our Christian life, at least at its beginning. When we were baptized, when we received the sacraments of initiation, we are released from the power of the devil. We're released from Pharaoh and his taskmasters in a whole new way. And so the Lord sends his Son, Jesus Christ, among us to be the Messiah. But Jesus is more than just the Messiah. He's a new Moses. He gives us a new law. He leads us out into a new form of freedom, a spiritual freedom, by his shed blood. All right? And so that's really what today's reading, I think, tells us as Christians, right? We have much to be thankful for because we've been delivered from so much that we were enslaved to. So we thank God that what he has done for us is as epic as the story of Exodus is. God has done something even greater for you and I by sending his Son, by having us baptized, and by giving us himself in his Holy Eucharist. Well, I hope this reflection was of some benefit to you. I pray that God blesses you, your family, and your day. And I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.